outset that I was not directly involved in the Battle of El Alamein. I served with the British First Army in the torch landings, which went in Algeria and Morocco.
Yes.
And so that my service was carried out on the western part of the battle area of North Africa. So I served in Algeria and Tunisia.
Okay, well...
At El Alamein, and I flew Spitfires.
Okay. Well, in my letter I said Alamein, but actually I'm interested in the whole North African area, so that's also interesting for me. And so could you tell me, at what date did you arrive in, so 11th of November 1942 was the day the landing occurred, right?
Yes, it was just shortly after that. I was occupied as the night fighter defence over Gibraltar for the torch landings, and I joined a squadron in North Africa a few days after. Okay.
So what were things like in North Africa? You had the Vichy French at the start that were there for a couple of days at first, eh?
That's right, yes. We had some assistance from various French troops there. The Gorms, for instance, were around us, and they were on our side. I think some of the Vichy French were not, but I wasn't directly involved with them. Our particular task was what they call command of the air, which meant we were fighter versus fighter, trying to keep the air free of the enemy. So we were up against the Italians and the Germans, basically.
Yeah, okay. And
very little contact, really.
Yeah, of course, I understand. You were at your air base and flying your aircraft, so you wouldn't have been in touch with much of what was going on the ground, I suspect.
No, that is right.
So what could you tell me about what you saw of the war, your pilot vision of the war?
In North Africa, yes. When I joined the squadron, it was based at Bone, which was a small port, well forward, just behind the front lines at the time, and it was the main supply port for the British First Army. We were based right at Bone with another squadron and some Spitfires flown by Americans, all based on the same little aerodrome, which was bombed and strafed daily and all night as well. Hitler reacted quite severely when the torch landings occurred and sent quite a lot of his elite air force plus bombers from Sicily and his army. We were up against the German army there too with Tiger tanks. The fighting was, to start with, very vicious. We had Spitfire Mark 5s with what they called a Vokes filter, which, according to us, lowered the performance noticeably. We were up against the focke Wulf 190s and ME 109Gs of the Richthofen Squadron, which is one of the German elite squadrons, and we were definitely below par as far as the performance was concerned. In the finish, we were wiped out. We ended up with one aeroplane and a few pilots when we were withdrawn. We had no real protection with ground flak, or except from ships in the harbour. And we found the going very hard. The German Air Force had command of the air and really virtually sat over our own aerodrome all day, so there was some pretty heavy fighting there. I have recollections of it being particularly vicious. So later on the situation changed. We went back and got a Mark 9 Spitfire, which was a much better performing machine, and we were on a par then with the focke 190s and ME 109s, and the tables were turned. So we ended up with, well, I wouldn't exactly say command of the air, but we certainly could look after ourselves and look after others. So the actual intensity of the aerial fighting reduced quite a lot, and we didn't lose so many people. Well, the last thing I remember when the campaign finished was a big victory parade in Tunis, where our squadron was chosen as the cover over the top to stop any raids, because Mr. Churchill or Mr. Roosevelt, and I forget whether Joseph Stalin was there, but the other two certainly were, and there were many troops and many very important persons around. So we flew cover over the top and made sure that they were not interfered with in any way. That was our last task in North Africa. We went on to Malta after that.
And which was your unit? What was your squadron number?
My squadron was number 81 Squadron.
Okay. And so you mentioned that at the beginning your unit was pretty much wiped out. Were the planes mostly destroyed on the ground by all this fighting, or was there also very vicious aerial fighting?
There was lots of vicious aerial fighting, but also we were bombed during the day. We had very little protection, anti-aircraft protection, and certainly no night fighter protection. So they bombed all night. They bombed the harbour and also our aerodrome, but during the day we were subject to strafing attacks from the German fighters and also bombing. So we lost quite a number on the ground, but we lost a lot of pilots as well in the aerial fighting.
Okay. And
in the initial stage.
Are there any dog fights or aerial fights that you were personally involved in that come to mind?
Well, one definitely does, which I wrote my memoirs, which were eventually published in Britain, actually. So there's a book on sale which covers my recollections of all that went on. But yes, I forget your question again now. I've lost my track.
Well, I just asked if some of the fighting you were involved in comes to mind, specific encounters.
Well, I remember one particular encounter where two of us were on patrol, and there were a whole squadron of ME-109, 12 of them. I was relatively aggressive and not terribly experienced, and rather silly at the time. I saw these enemy aircraft, and my understanding was if you saw any enemy aircraft, you went into the attack.
Okay.
So that's what I did, letting my number one know that that was what I was doing, and he went off home and reported me killed. I had a lone fight with the 12-109s until they decided they were running out of fuel. And I wasn't a very good target, so they decided to knock it off and head for home.
Okay.
Saved by bacon. That's one I remember, but there were many other little dog fights at times, either where I was on the receiving end, on most of them flying Spitfire Mark 5s, but on the 9s it was a different matter. That's where we were much more aggressive.
Okay.
That's one particular one that I do recall, and unlikely to forget.
And you mentioned that there was only one aircraft left at the initial stage. So
one serviceable aircraft was all we had left. We could put up.
So what happened to your specific aircraft?
Mine, when I joined the squadron, I joined with two others, an Australian and another British pilot. We landed, the aerodrome we were on was fitted with bomb craters. The runways had lots of bomb craters on them. The rest of it was a sea of mud. It was very wet there then, and very cold too. And the actual, most of the aerodrome area was just a sea of mud. But the runways were kept clear, and the bomb craters on the runways were fixed as the bombs exploded. A team of army engineers came in and filled them, so that we sort of had to thread our way around the bomb craters, which were fairly soft, try to miss them and take off and landings and so on. my aeroplane, when I landed, some bombers appeared out of the clouds, which is about, I suppose the ceiling would have been about 3,000 feet. The bomb bays were open. They were actually starting to drop the bombs. So we dived for slit trenches, and the stick of bombs came right across our particular dispersal, and my aeroplane was a heap of tangled metal at the finish. It stopped one of the bombs, I believe, right in the cockpit. So that was my talk.
What did you do then the rest of the time? You just stayed on the ground?
No. I was given a sick Spitfire to fly back to Algiers, Maison Blanche aerodrome, and leave it there. Then I hitchhiked to Gibraltar and collected another a good Spitfire and flew it back.
Okay.
So in other words, they gave me the job of replacing the lost aircraft.
And this replacement was a Mark 9?
No, Mark 5.
Okay. And were you ever involved in strafing German vehicles or trains or tanks or anything like that? Yes.
We generally, our task was command of the air, so we were prevented from attacking on the ground. That wasn't our job, but when we did get command of the air and so on, we did start strafing, and my own involvement was vehicles and so on, but particularly the one I found distasteful was when the German troops were bottled up in Cape Bon. They were exposed and didn't have enough trenches for them. There were many of them, and the Germans were trying to get them over to Italy, and we were strafing. And there I had to strafe troops in the open ground, and it was a very unpleasant job. If I had been shot down or had engine failure or forced down behind the enemy lines, I think I would have ended up as mincemeat. I think I would have been torn limb from limb by those people, and I wouldn't have blamed them. It was until they capitulated, it was pretty nasty. I remember that quite well. There was another occasion during the campaign when near the finish, the 8th Army was near the Maris line, I think, or just north of the Maris line, and there were 3 or 4 Tiger tanks still left in North Africa. They were hidden, and the British wished to find out where they were. They were responsible for the Kasserine Pass debacle, where the American troops, which were pretty green, if they'd seen action before, they were faced with the German army, and some of them broke and ran. Some of them did hold their positions, but the Germans burst through. So the Tiger tank was a rather revered enemy vehicle. We were sent to escort 2 aircraft sent specifically to find these tanks, and there were 6 of us escorting these 2 Spitfires. Photographic reconnaissance Spitfires they were. We eventually found the Tiger tanks, reported their position, and then, because the German army was bottled up, they had plenty of anti-aircraft guns, and I think there were hundreds of them, particularly breeder 20 millimeters, and it was like being chased by a fire hose. We had about 30 miles to go from behind the enemy lines back to our own, and I think every inch of it was covered with these breeder 4-barreled 20 millimeter guns. It was a case of being followed by a hose of shells all the way back, which took around about 5 minutes, I suppose. I remember that we were very violently manoeuvring around, watching this trail of sparks flicking backwards and forwards behind us as the gunners followed us, trying to bring their shells to bear onto us. We got 1 Spitfire hit, a friend of mine, but otherwise we managed to dodge it all and escape. So yes, we did a bit of ground strafing and so on.
And the one who was hit, did he manage to fly back? Or?
Yes, he landed okay, but his Spitfire had stopped one cannon shell anyway, at least went right through the cockpit, and he was wounded.
Okay. And was strafing or strafing, was that considered a dangerous job because of all the ground fire?
Oh yes, it was considered a very dangerous job. We wondered about the value of it, whether the cost-benefit ratio was worthwhile. That was my own personal consideration, because all we had were 2 cannons and 4 machine guns. It was all right against troops and so on, but as far and against open vehicles, if you caught vehicles out in the open. But usually they were pretty well covered by anti-aircraft guns, and it was a pretty hazardous occupation, ground strafing.
Okay, and you mentioned that your task was command of the air, so were there other aircraft that were perhaps more heavily armored that had the task of strafing?
Yes. Hurricane fighters, they had Hurricane fighters there, they carried bombs, and the Hurricane 2C had 4 20mm cannons, and they were used for ground strafing. They were slower and a more sturdy aircraft which could take a fair amount of punishment. So they were used, but some Spitfires later on carried bombs too, but they were used for ground strafing, but not ourselves.
Okay. But, so at the time, the Spitfires you were flying, they were considered the sort of crown jewels that had to be saved for aerial fighting, and other aircraft were left for the strafing. Is that?
Well, I think that was the general tactic. We were strictly prevented from doing that and exposing our aircraft to ground fire. They were needed for the command of the air activities, of course. But later on, when things eased off, we used to carry out the ground attack role as well.
Okay. And
plenty of aircraft then.
And in the time in North Africa, was your own plane ever shot down? I mean, you said one was destroyed by a bomb. Were you ever shot down by an enemy aircraft and had to bail out or anything like that?
No. I've been hit several times, but I've never been shot down. Oh, I'm sorry, over Salerno I was. I think I was hit by debris off the bomber I was shooting at, but others said I was hit by their return fire. I had to force land at Salerno airstrip while it was danger of being overrun. But that was in Italy, and that was the only time I was ever knocked out of the air. Other times I was hit, but always managed to get back home, and no, I never had to take the parachute, although on 2 occasions I came very close to it.
Okay. You said you wrote a book. What's the title of the book?
Oh, the title of the book's From North Africa to the Arakan. The Arakan is the rice bowl of India down on the coast in Bangladesh now. It's called From North Africa to the Arakan, and just by myself, Flight Lieutenant Peart.
Okay. And what was the weather and temperature like in your part of Africa? I suspect in Tunisia and Algeria it was not as hot as in Egypt, eh?
No, far from it.
And you in November I suspect it was actually cold.
Very cold, miserable, wet. It was not nice, but later on when the campaign finished in the summer, the weather was very nice. It was quite hot then. And the other thing I remember which stood out was a number of snakes around. There seemed to be hundreds of snakes of various varieties, including mambas, out on the open sort of scrubby country. I saw more snakes in North Africa than I saw out in India or anywhere else.
Okay, did you ever have any trouble with them? Did anybody get bitten or anything like that?
Not that I remember, no, I don't think so.
But did you have to be careful?
Oh, I had to be careful, yes. I personally saw a green mamba and a black mamba. They were reputably dangerous snake, aggressive. Not the ones I saw anyway, they took off, but they could be, I gather. So we treated them with great respect, and they kept their distance too, I think.
Okay. Had you been briefed about the snakes? I mean, no?
No.
How did you know what types of snakes there were? You had an interest in snakes at the time, or?
General knowledge. You read as boys, boys' books about the various snakes and about various countries. I'd always been an avid reader about other countries and what went on there, and so I knew stories about the various snakes and so on. And you learned, of course, as you went on. If I saw one, I asked what it was, and if I could find out, I did so. And so, while I couldn't identify a number of them, you could certainly pick a green and black mamba. They were a big snake.
Okay. And what were the quarters like at the airfield? Did you have to sleep in foot trenches, or did you have houses you could sleep in, or?
To start with, at Bone, we lived in a hotel which was destroyed by bombs eventually, just the night after we moved out. So we were in a safer place from there. During the day, if we weren't on patrol in the air or involved in something, we spent the time in slit trenches, or else we had our dispersal was a bombed out concrete remnant of a civilian building. There were no chairs or anything. It was just a concrete shell. We sort of sat and froze in there, just on the concrete floor against the wall while waiting to take off or something. Otherwise, it was just innocent trenches. At times, we had no food. We had to scrounge food. We had to beg, borrow, or steal. But that was not for long, but it certainly did occur. We cooked our own meals for a while, well, the situation was not terribly good. But okay, we got by. That was during the sort of settling in stage, the early stage of the torch landings.
Okay. And by the way, I forgot to ask, were you in the Royal Air Force or the Royal New Zealand Air Force?
I joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force, received my training in New Zealand, and then I was sent straight over to Britain, where I joined a Royal Air Force squadron.
Okay.
And so from there on, I served with the Royal Air Force.
Okay. And at what date did you arrive in Britain?
In 1941, near Christmas in 1941.
Okay. So you mentioned that in North Africa there was German and Italian fighters. Were there many Italian fighters? Did they last for long, or what?
I got one of them dead. I had a combat with one pair of them, and I got hit on that occasion. The Italian fighters I was up against were the Maschi C-202. I flew one later, and it was a very good machine, and I think the Italian Air Force could have done better with those machines. But so we were up against the Italians. That was in North Africa. I struck Germans only in Britain. In the dieppe raid there, we were a bit mauled again against the focke 190. We lost, the RAF lost quite a lot of aeroplanes there. And then the next day also, we lost some of our squadron. But I didn't see any Italians there, but North Africa, yes, the Italians were there. And they also appeared in Sicily when we went through Sicily as well.
And how did the Italians usually compare with the Germans? I mean, in North Africa, for example.
They were not aggressive. We didn't find them aggressive. I'm sure they must have had some very good pilots, but the general feeling towards them was that we didn't have to worry about them too much. They were not aggressive. We were the ones who would be the aggressors.
Okay. And the Germans, on the other hand, were very aggressive? Or?
Very aggressive, and always were, but we each had our separate tactics to, of course, use the strength of our particular machines. The Germans had speed and firepower, and I think that was basically it. Whereas we had manoeuvrability, firepower somewhat similar, but not quite as good, I think. We didn't have the speed on them, except the total speed, but the acceleration. The Focke 190 was a very, very fast machine. It could accelerate very quickly, and it had heavy firepower, and more manoeuvrability than we thought it had. The German 109s, they were used mainly as on fighter command of the air work. We could outmaneuver them as we thought, but I read books later on where they were restricted because of particular design problems. So it did allow us the advantage of manoeuvrability. The dive speeds were around about the same. Their acceleration was a bit faster because they had a fuel-injected engine, and we didn't. We had a gravity-fed carburetor, so that the aeroplane flying upside down, the engine would cut. In the case of the Germans, it wouldn't. So that gave them an advantage as far as tactics and escape was concerned. So altogether, they were much of a muchness, and it depended on pilot versus pilot. Some of the German pilots were very good. You could pick them once you counted them in the air, the good ones, and you could pick the new chums. So you tried to pick the new chums if you could.
Okay. And you mentioned the dieppe. That, of course, has nothing to do with North Africa, but that's interesting because I'm Canadian as well, and so it's always something we talk about. What was that day like?
Which one was that?
Dieppe.
Oh, Dieppe. Oh, well, it was a really, it's regarded generally, I think, then as one of the biggest fighter battles of the war. The figures which were banded about was that the day after Dieppe, I don't know how many during the actual raid were in the air at any one time, but the day after, we were told that the RAF had to prove to the Germans that we were still a potent force, because we lost something like 120 fighters on the Dieppe raid itself, and I think the Germans lost somewhere about half that. Now, so that they got as many Spitfires as they could find and sent them back over the next day, and there was another big combat, which was regarded as the big combat of the war, about 500 on each side. And again, we lost heavily, of course. So how things sort of subsided after that and reverted back to the normal sort of patrols and elbows and sweeps and all that type of thing.
And what did you personally do on the day of the raid on the next day?
I was a relatively inexperienced pilot there. I was the tethered goat. I was the tail end Charlie. I remember seeing the vapor trails of the Focke 190s up above us. Well, it looked as though they were doing aerobatics almost at about 35,000 feet, and we were sort of hanging on our props at 30,000 feet. So I felt totally vulnerable there. And apart from that, you don't see very much either until you get certain very necessary attributes. You don't really know what's going on around you, because you've got to pick things up in a sort of an open space, and the eye doesn't adjust quickly to the various focal lengths, so that while it's at one focal length, you can pick the enemy aeroplanes within that sort of shell of the sphere around you. Those inside, you're not focused on them, and the chances are you won't see them until you learn to use your eyes varying focal distances all the time around, so that it picks up things in a three-dimensional space. You're totally vulnerable, and a lot of people, I'm sure, were killed until they acquired that particular skill. In my case, I hadn't acquired that skill, and although I was told I was attacked and shot at, I didn't see a thing.
Okay. And how did you acquire the skill? Was that something that you pilots talked about, or did it just sort of come on its own, or how did you learn?
Well, I suppose I was like most others. You think a lot about various situations and what you have to do and so on. I could say a lot about our training, or lack of it, for aerial combat at that particular time. They were very short of pilots and so on. We didn't receive any formal training on this sort of thing that I'm talking about. You had to learn that the hard way in actual combat itself. And if you survived, well, you acquired those skills. If you didn't, you didn't acquire them. And I can't recall receiving any very much training in that regard, or very much guidance either. I think everybody was really concentrating on their own drawbacks or their own skills, and felt perhaps inadequate as people to pass them on. So things were pretty busy, and you just took part, and you learned them by talking to others and by personal experience. Now, I might find plenty of people who will say that's not correct, but that was my own experience. Okay.
And you said you were actually shot at, you were told, but you hadn't noticed anything on that day.
Well, I saw the vapor trails of these things above us, but of course they came down and attacked, and their tactics were to fly right through the formations and then dive away and use their speed and acceleration so that they outdistanced us and we couldn't get a shot at them, you see.
Okay.
Our people stuck together, and so that you were attacked, and while they were attacking, the more experienced one of ours would turn around and fire, and they'd fire at each other and so on, so we'd get some kills ourselves. But that was the general thing, and the new chum like me was busy trying to stay with my number one, my leader, concentrating on that, and you missed out on these things, so I didn't see even the Focke 190s attacking us.
Okay.
So they came through and they shot at me and then dived away, and they missed.
Okay. And you were from New Zealand, so you were all volunteer army, I think, at the time, right?
All of us were.
Okay. Just as a curiosity, what was the incentive for you at the time to volunteer?
I wanted to make a career as a Royal Air Force fighter pilot. Ever since I was a boy, I used to read avidly about it, so I always intended to. My parents refused to let me do that, so I had to pick another career and prepare for it, but I still was only 17 years of age, and so I still wanted to fly a Spitfire. I'd seen a photograph of a Spitfire, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I thought it was a beautiful aeroplane. That was my ambition, eventually realized.
Okay.
Short.
So did you stay in the Air Force after the war as well then, or?
No, I'd had enough. By the time I'd finished just under 2 years in India against the Japanese, I started getting the illnesses, dysentery and malaria and jungle ulcers and you name it. My health suddenly failed on me, and I think I wasn't told directly, but I think I was invalided home. I was in grade 3 or something. It took me some time to get my weight back and recover physical health again.
Okay. So you'd had enough of the dream. After.
To put it bluntly, I'd had enough for a while anyway.
Okay. And regarding North Africa, is there any other interesting aspects of that area that you could think of mentioning, or any interesting stories that happened, or nothing in particular?
No, except that it was a very it seemed very First World War-ish, if I could call it that, where the stories abounded of gallantry and so on during the First World War. Well, it still existed in North Africa against the German squadrons there. I don't think there was any real animosity. They carried out their job and we carried out ours. And it involved killing and all the rest of it, so there was no quarter given there. But there were certain rules which were observed by most, and I'll say most, not all. That shooting a person down in his parachute, or strafing a downed aeroplane on the ground. Some of us didn't want to be ruthless killers. We had a job to do, and we would kill to get that aeroplane out of the sky and so on, but we didn't like the business of shooting a person in the back or strafing him on the ground and that type of thing. And perhaps I was one of that category. And I noticed that in our combats against the Germans generally, they observed that. They had their bad guys, if you like to call it that, and we had ours too. But by and large, there was a mutual respect, I think, for each other in North Africa. That did not apply against the Japanese.
Okay, and what about the Germans in Dieppe or in Italy? Was that any different, or?
Well, with Dieppe, I was so inexperienced there that...
Well, let's say Italy then. Was it less?
Oh yes, in Italy, of course, we were the ones with the command of the air. So all combats there were really chase ones, where they were trying to escape. We were the aggressors. So if anything, I suppose it's for them to say whether we were courteous and so on.
Okay.
I think we were. I think we tried to. Well, the bomber I shot down, which eventually hit me too, that was a case, I think, where we had the opportunity of applying it, and we did. It was shot down and it crash landed. It didn't hit the ground. It landed under control on a hillside, and my feeling there, and I had another couple of Spitfires with me, my feeling there was that the crew would have escaped, probably injured, but they had a chance of being alive. The other two, who were new chums, they'd never had a combat before, were going to Strata, and I ordered them away, told them to leave it alone. There's been quite a story about that since, a lot of research put into it. Turned out the German pilot was wounded, his navigator was wounded, the rest of the crew were killed, so two of them escaped. Now, that was a case where we had the opportunity of exercising a little bit of discretion and decency. I think that applied.
And how did you find out what happened to the pilots and navigators? You made touch after the war or something? Or?
Well, I suppose, like yourself, there are thousands of people around delving into the history of various incidents during the war, and this is one of them. It has attracted the attention of a lot of historians because it was one of the first bombers to drop radio-controlled bombs on a big British battleship in the Bay of Salerno.
Okay.
I happened to be on patrol. We were based in Sicily, on patrol at the time, and we shot this one down, one of the bombers.
Okay, I understand. Usually the aerial warfare attracts a lot more attention than infantry things. I noticed. I've done quite a bit of research into little stories. Soldiers who kept a dog tag as a souvenir or a picture from a soldier, things like that, and I've done research into that. But I noticed when an aircraft is shot down, it usually attracts quite a lot of attention, and a lot of people are very interested in that. And
well, there are at least three different historians involved with this bomber one I'm just telling you about, who've been in touch with me, and each has looked at a different aspect. One was had a relation living in the area who actually observed the combat, and he wrote to me Another one looked at the German records, and which opened my eyes. There was more to it than I actually saw. But and then there was another chap who looked into our records. Our records are faulty too. So this is an interesting point, because I think the stories which come out about these various incidents, I'm a little bit suspicious, because in this particular one, our own squadron records are inaccurate and wrong. And I was there, and I know who I had with me, and they got that wrong as a record. So you know, how much of the others is true too?
Well, I've been doing a lot of research in southern France, in the area where I live, about the infantry fighting, and interviewing lots of the local residents and lots of the veterans, and the official histories are usually, they're a good guideline, let's say, but when it comes to the details, there's often a lot of mistakes.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, yes.
So it's, you have to take it with a grain of salt, as they say.
That's right. You're quite correct.
And you mentioned the Japanese. This is way out of North Africa, obviously, but since you're interesting to talk to, what was it like against them as compared to the Germans?
Entirely different tactics. The tactics were reversed. We adopted German-type tactics because we had bigger advantages, and the Japanese were much more maneuverable than we were. In fact, they were amazingly maneuverable with quite modern machines and much more heavily armed than we expected. But by and large, there was no quarter given. There was real hate there. Their behaviour towards our chaps and prisoners was such that we would have not hesitated to shoot anybody down that parachute or on the ground. We were out to kill them, that's all. So there was a different attitude entirely. Excuse me, what? Which checkbook? What? Thank you. And the Japanese were quite numerous to start with. They had command of the air for the early years, and we were the first squadron sent out with Spitfire Mark 8s. We flew them out from Egypt, and I think proved the first route, that long flight out of, well, about a quarter of the way around the world, I suppose. Took our own aeroplanes all the way up to India. And they were Mark 8s, and they were the first really high quality fighter to come up against the Japanese there. We had advantages of climb rate, power, altitude, speed, just about everything except maneuverability. They were highly maneuverable. I think our feeling about them was most of their people were pretty experienced. They hadn't suffered much in the way of casualties, so that most of their pilots were very professional as far as their abilities were concerned. So the initial combats were a bit prolonged and so on. Our tactics were to attack and dive away and climb away out of sight and come back and keep attacking, you see. And they would hang around for a while, but after they lost a few people, they started to break off and head for home, run for home. So gradually we got partial command of the air. We thought we were doing pretty well, but the Japanese apparently didn't accept that we had command of the air for most of the time. And I was involved in the siege of Imphal and the Battle of the Arikans down there, and also with the Chindits within Broadway, which was a fight. We got wiped out. There's 6 of us, and I was the sole surviving Spitfire. Lost our commanding officer and so on. But that's a different story. All in the book.
Okay. And at what date were you returned home? In 1945 or?
1945 in February. I was. Okay. Well, I was a sick person then when I came home.